Hello, everybody.
Hello, Manfred.
Hi.
Hello, Manfred.
Hi. Great to see you,
Hey,
Davide.
all.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm really looking forward for this, Manfred. I've been following Module Federation from you and, how you've helped us. So this is really cool. We are just in the point where we need to implement now in one of our live projects. So we are waiting for Angular 12. So let's see what's there.
Cool. Great. Nice to hear that. So what is your project about?
It's basically we have several teams working on different bits and they kind of meet the criteria which you explained when I attended your course that if you don't have separate deployment requirements, then you shouldn't go for it if you can work with a monorepo. But this is special because the teams are quite distinct. They work in their own pattern and we don't normally know them. And they are like, it's like an offshore team working in a different country, India, and I'm in UK. So they were looking forward for this, and I said let's wait for this to finish, come formalize in Angular 12 and we can think about it. So now they've been asking questions, so should we use it, should we use it? I said let's wait, let's see how it goes. But basically they are different sections of the app doing smaller things, and they want to have a seamless experience basically. And
I can imagine. Okay. Yeah, that looks great. That sounds great. That really sounds like the perfect fit for Module Federation and Micro-Frontends. Cool. Nice case study. So what's the business domain? Is it banking or is it something?
No, it's pharmaceuticals. So lab equipment. It's a US company called Agilent. They do all the lab equipments and pharmaceuticals, and it's a medical domain. So it's not banking also, but it's quite niche domain in that sense. I don't know the full business knowledge of it. I'm a contractor there, but do stuff what we've been told. So, but that's a domain. So
Nice.
they have like, so they have softwares that are used in labs by the various laboratories around the world, and then different teams provide different stats for different equipments like maintenance schedule and new features that they've added and some charts and fancy graphics and stuff. But they all developed by different teams using different Angular versions, shall I say. So we'll see how this goes also. So
cool.
But they're all Angular, which is key here, if I understand from a module federation point of view. So
nice. I have the opinion or the impression that healthcare is really an area where you can use micro-frontends, because normally in the area of healthcare, you have huge applications where you need several teams, and so it seems to be a fit.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I will not be able to.
Sorry, I did not get the last part of the sentence. We are not able to. And then you've been gone.
Okay, Manfred, I think you can start share your screen now.
Great.
I'll just stop this one.
Okay. Let's reload this just to be on the safe side. And here I have some slides.
Perfect.
So today, if you are a scooter person, I think you will like the introduction. If you are a moped person, I also have some stuff for you. So don't worry if this is not your vehicle of choice here. Tarek told me he was a moped person. I was a scooter person, but without strong opinions about it. It was what have been available for me back then. I guess we still have some time or some minutes, I guess.
If I may ask a question then?
Of course, with pleasure.
Hello, we have started using Micro-Frontends for a while since we saw your initial post with, I mean, we were using Angular 9 back then, or 8, and using the NGX Build Plus. And now we are going through a redesign and thought of also upgrading to Angular. We now are using 11, but yeah, Webpack 5 is now only in 12, and that's why I'm very excited about this presentation. Yeah, the question is the transition from the old NGX Build Plus to this Webpack 5. Is it something that it's straightforward, or we need some, I don't know, structural modifications? Or
I guess it should not be that difficult. I have the very same situation with a customer of mine. They started quite early, and back then using something like NGX Build Plus was the best option for them. But meanwhile, since half a year, we have module federation. And since last week, it really works straightforward and rock solid with Angular. And so they are migrating to. Normally, I guess you have some place in your application that acts as a loader for a micro-front, and should be a central place. And this is what you need to adjust a bit. Then you should be on the safe side.
So just the platform itself, or the backbone for all these micro-frontends?
I hope so, and I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, we are generating the bundle and adding a hash to it, and basically having a JSON that always tells which is the latest hash, so that we don't always load the, I mean, we have the lazy loading and we refresh the bundles only with a new version. But right now we are having some problems with routing, for example. Once you enter a micro-frontend and that its router kicks in, then basically all the other routing is kaput.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. This is one of the biggest challenges, because the router is not designed to work together with another version of itself, and it is not used to share the URL. The router normally assumes that the URL belongs to it. And yeah, this is a challenge. It is solvable. For instance, I had used, instead of a path for the router, a path matcher, which is a function that tells the router if it is responsible for this path or not. And this is one way of sharing one big URL among several routers. But the good message is, when you go with module federation, you can just go with one router, because with module federation, Angular itself does not even recognize that you have micro-frontends. For Angular itself, it looks like lazy loading. From Webpack's perspective, it is clearly about micro-frontends.
Thank you very much.
I think that's the beauty of this new stuff, right, Manfred? You don't have to mess with routers. That's the most cleanest stuff.
Yeah, totally. You can use your framework as is. You don't need to tweak your framework, because your framework doesn't even know that you are going with micro-frontends.
Okay, guys. So I think we can start slowly. The plan for today is first the presentation, the Manfred presentation and demo. Then we talk a little bit about the brand new Manfred's video course. And then we have a Q&A session. So if you like it, just say it on chat. And of course, can you tell us, can you hear us? Can you see us? Everything is okay? If yes, I think we can start. Manfred, are you ready?
Yeah, great.
Perfect.
So thanks, Tarek, for organizing this. This will be about, I call it federated Angular, which is my short form for micro-frontends with Angular and module federation. And when I prepared for this, a little story came in mind. And as you can imagine, this story involves scooters. But let me elaborate on this. What you see here is the high school I attended between being 15 and 20 years old. And at the beginning of high school, we were really looking forward to becoming 16 finally. Because back then in Austria, with 16, we have been allowed to drive a tiny motorcycle. We call it a moped. I think it's called the same in other countries around the world. And we had a lot of strong discussions about what's best, a moped or a scooter. Some people were into scooters, some people were into mopeds, and for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason, the scooter people have not been best friends with moped people and vice versa. And we really discussed hard which of those options is the best one. And when looking back to this, I really have to say this was a ridiculous discussion because you cannot tell what's best in general. I think this is always the case when doing decisions. It's always about consequences in your very situation. That means you need to find out your needs, you need to find out about the consequences, and you have to evaluate the consequences against your needs, against your requirements in your very situation. This is what you need to do in general. And obviously, when it comes to the moped versus scooter discussion, there are not that much consequences. It's more or less a matter of taste, and when you are 16, it's also about belonging to this or to that group. And this really reminds me to software architecture, because software architecture is pretty much about this. It is pretty much about doing decisions. And so it's also pretty much about dealing with consequences in your very situation. This is always the case when it comes to architectures, and especially if we talk about micro-frontends, because boy, micro-frontends come with a lot of consequences, and not all of them are great. Some of them are great, some of them are awesome, but some of them can be real showstoppers. So what do I mean when I'm talking about micro-frontends? Well, at the end of the day, for me, micro-frontends are just about decomposing a big application. You don't want to implement a huge application capable of everything. Instead of this, you want to implement several tiny applications, several tiny and hence less complex applications. The thing is, we are interested in the tiny, less complex applications, but the customer isn't. The consumer wants to have one integrated solution. And that's why we need to find a way to load all those micro-frontends into something I would call a shell. Here we see a shell, and this shell is loading this or that micro-frontend on demand. And here the critical aspect is that those micro-frontends need to be compiled in isolation. They need to be compiled separately. They are also deployed separately. for instance, by different teams. And somehow at runtime, we want to load the newest or a configured version into the middle of our shell. And yeah, for this, you need several tricks. And this is what this webinar is about. In this webinar, I prepared 3 things for you. I will start with the why. We will look into why people out there in the real world are using micro-frontends. A good friend of mine told me, Manfred, you know, the real world is where the pizza boy comes from, which was a great hint for me because, you know, as a programmer, you don't have that much contact with the real world. Just kidding. The second part is about the how to implement micro-frontends. And for this, there are several answers. There are several implementation strategies. We will look into a quite new strategy, which is about module federation. It's quite new and really straightforward. Perhaps it's the missing link for micro-frontends. And then we will look into the what, namely into what's next. What are new features that are arriving now and in the course of the next month? New features that leverage Webpack 5, Angular 12, and some new ideas we had. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I am Manfred. I am a trainer and consultant for Angular. I'm helping a lot of companies with Angular for enterprise scale applications. And that's why also micro-frontends is one of my main topics. And besides this, I'm quite connected to the Angular community. If you're wondering where this accent comes from, I live in Austria. I do a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy if I can work together with people around the globe. Nowadays, this is done with remote technologies, so it's even easier. Okay, let's get started with the first part I've prepared for you. This is about the why. Why did my customer decide for micro-frontends? For this, I collected some real-world case studies amongst them. I gave them some questionnaires to fill out. And one of the companies that filled out my questionnaire, one of my customers in that area, is Daedalus Healthcare. Perhaps you know Daedalus Healthcare. It was formerly known as Agfa Healthcare. This name Agfa immediately rang a bell when I saw it, because I knew it from my childhood. Back then, when I was a little boy, they produced audio cassettes for doing a security backup of your cassettes you've bought. And I really had a lot of cassettes from the Agfa band. But this division of Agfa, which is now with Daedalus, is implementing a hospital information system. So it's about healthcare. And if you imagine a hospital, there are a huge amount of specialist divisions. Specialist divisions like X-ray or like cancer and so on and so forth. And you can imagine in each specialist division, you have a lot of different rules and workflows and a lot of different data structures. And somehow they need to bring all this together into this hospital information system. That's why they decided for micro-frontends. They implement the stuff for each and every specialist division. You could call it business domain with another term, with a separate team, with an application of their own, and then everything is integrated into this common hall. This is what they are doing there with micro-frontends. Funny side story, they already started with micro-frontends in a time where the word micro-frontends has not even been coined. They just did it without knowing the term micro-frontends. They did it out of their business needs. How cool is that? Another case study I've brought is DATEV. DATEV is a quite huge company. You see it here, 8,000 employees. And they are specialized into software for accountants and lawyers. And one of their main product is a payroll accounting solution. You know, some people are looking for work, and for some people having work is not enough. They want to have money at the end of the month. And for this, there are a lot of legislations. There are a lot of laws regulating this. And they are baking all those laws into their software. With this product that looks like this in the newest version, they have about 80 developers. And I think that tells how huge this product is. And somehow they need to scale their development process. That means they are looking for ways to split it up to several sub-teams and to bring the parts together at the end of the day. By the way, this here is the corporate identity of DATEV. It really looks nice, but at the end of the day, their products are really complex. But the thing is, they have a good UI expert, and that's why it really looks nice and lightweight, despite the thing it's heavyweight underneath the covers, heavyweight and complex. Another case study I've collected is from a bank. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to tell the name of the bank, but it's a huge European bank. They are here in Austria, they are in Germany, they are also in Poland and in other countries. And what they are currently doing, they are rewriting their e-banking system. And you know, for us, an e-banking system looks really cute. There are several tiles. This tile is telling me that I'm broke. This tile is telling me that I won't get a loan anymore, and so on and so forth. But one more time, those tiles with its data come from different business domains. Accountant management is a business domain of its own. Loan management is a business domain of its own. Stock management is a business domain of its own. And so it's the case that they need to implement all of this in isolation and bring it together for us into something that looks like a very nice, tiny, cute front. Another bank I'm consulting has a quite similar requirement. They are implementing a customer relationship management system. You can imagine that this way, the customer is calling, they are complaining, something does not work, and then the customer care agent needs to collect data of this customer. And this data comes from different business domains. And they need to collect this data in order to be capable of helping this very customer. And one more time, it comes from different domains and hence from different applications we need to integrate here. This is the last case study I've prepared for you. It's from Quality Bytes. It's a small business run by a friend of mine. And when I visited them in Germany, they told me, hey, Manfred, come on, we are just one agile team. We are just 7 plus minus people, and hence splitting everything into several front ends would be an overkill for us. We don't want to do it. And so here we really decided against micro-frontends because it would be an overkill. But nevertheless, something that's really interesting here, even though they are not going with micro-frontends, they are going with domain slicing. They define their domains, and within their source space, they make sure that one domain is not directly interacting with other domains. Because in this case, everything would be coupled to everything else. Everything would be intermingled to everything else. And this leads to software that is not maintainable in the long run. That's why they are separating their domains within a monorepo. By the way, for this, they are using an X-style monorepos with access restrictions. If you are interested into this, in the last webinar, it's recorded, I guess Darek can send you the hyperlink. We talked about this and we also showed some examples for this. But mentioning this case study is really important for me because it clearly shows micro frontends can solve issues, but they are not the answer to everything. And that's why we are also talk a lot about domain cutting and about other strategies for modeling and implementing your business domains in your applications. As mentioned before, I gave them a questionnaire and they filled it out. They gave me permission to share the results with you. And one of the questions here was, why did you decide for going with micro frontends? And most of them told me, well, we have a huge product or even a product suite. Think about the hospital information system, for instance, and somehow we need to bring together the different parts to a common shell. That's why we decided for micro frontends. And this goes hand in hand with the second reason they've told me, namely it's all about scaling teams and scaling business domains. It's about having one specialized team responsible for this business domain, another specialist team responsible for that business domain. They write their applications of their own, and then we need to bring it together somehow. Another reason they told me why they switched to micro frontends is to be capable of switching out technologies. Well, this is not that important in the short run, because honestly, in the short run, you don't want to have a framework suite. In the short run, you don't want to mix and match Angular with React and Vue without a good reason. But in the midterm and in the long term, this is important because technologies come and go, but business products are here to stay. Most of the business products have to be maintained for one or several decades. And so it would be nice if we would be capable of switching out technology on the run little by little, or even to implement the next business domain with another more modern technology. If you think back what you did 10 years ago, I guess it was not Angular. And I think that really shows that switching out your technology in the long run makes sense. In the short run, as mentioned, you don't want to have a framework suite. It's also about repeatedly changing requirements. Think about payroll accountancy. There you have a lot of laws and you have to implement those laws. Otherwise, you find yourself in prison if you do payroll accountancy without respecting proper laws. So yeah, they have to find a way to speed it up. Especially in times like this, where we have a lot of special rules in times like crisis, like Corona, that need to be respected when you are paying your people money. Well, I also asked them about the consequences they faced. And here I will focus on the negative consequences. And one very negative consequence they told me they faced was they had to implement a meter framework. Because suddenly they had several micro frontends within one browser window. And somehow they needed to orchestrate all of them. And so they needed to create a meter framework that is loading this or that micro frontend, that is routing between the micro frontend, that is allowing to communicate across those micro frontends. This is one of the consequences which caused a lot of effort. Pretty all of them told me that they faced this challenge. Another challenge was that they needed to find a way to share code at runtime. Because having 10 micro frontends does not mean that we want to load Angular 10 times. No, we just want to load it once and share it across all our separately compiled micro frontends. This reduces bundle sizes. Obviously, we just need to load it once. On the same side, It also increases the possibility for conflicts. Perhaps we have Angular 10 here and Angular 12 there. Sharing Angular 12 can lead to a version conflict because, you know, a new major version does not need to be backwards compatible. Also, it's about establishing a common look and feel. This might be more or less important depending upon in which area you are. If this is a very dry business product, perhaps a common look and feel is nice, but not the utmost requirement, the utmost important requirement. When it comes to a web page where conversion is a topic, having a common look and feel I just saw I had an issue with my microphone, so I think you should hear me now. Again, sometimes I need to unplug and replug my microphone. So if you buy a new laptop, my recommendation is don't buy a Dell. I really have a lot of issues with my Dell. Okay, so a lot of consequences. Here in this webinar, I will focus on the first two consequences because those consequences are technical consequences. The last one is more about your organization. It's more about establishing design systems. I will not talk about it today. Let's stick with the technical stuff. And with this technical stuff, we can directly go to the second part of this. It's about the how. How can we implement micro-frontends? And as mentioned before, there are a lot of possibilities for this. Here I'm going with module federation. It's quite new. It was released about a half year ago with Webpack. You know, Webpack is heavily used. That's why module federation is really out there in practice. Everyone using Webpack is also having module federation underneath the covers. And as you will see shortly, it's really a straightforward solution that helps you to deal with all the consequences I just showed you before. So the first step when implementing micro-frontends is domain slicing. You need to slice your big application into several domains. And now the big question is, what do we do with those domains? One option is to create a big monolith that is nicely structured, a big monolith that makes sure that one business domain within it is not directly interacting with other business domains in order to make it maintainable, in order to prevent that a change here is not destroying something there. This is something we talked about last time in the last webinar. Today, we are going one step further. Today, we are saying, well, separating the business domains in the source code is not enough. We are separating them a bit more. We are creating one application per business domain. And this has the big advantage that we can assign different teams to them. Those teams can work in isolation. They can work independently. They can do their own decisions. They can work like an agile team. They can publish their result when they are done. That means even though you have a lot of people on your project, you get back the agility of little, tiny, small agile teams. This is what we are doing here when going with micro-frontends, one micro-frontend per domain. But as mentioned before, somehow you need to find a way to load everything into your shell because the consumer wants to have an integrated user experience. And perhaps you're saying, well, come on, Manfred, that cannot be that difficult because we have the dynamic import. So why not use the dynamic import to point to this or to that micro front end in order to load it? Well, the thing is, in theory, this works perfectly. In theory, in practice nowadays, this does not work at all because of all the bundlers work. Bundlers like Webpack and the others. Those bundlers assume that everything is known at compile time, because the goal of those bundlers is to squeeze the last byte out of the bundles. Producing optimized tiny bundles is the ultimate goal here, because it's about bundle size and startup performance, isn't it? And to accomplish that, everything is compiled together, everything is optimized together, and then, and only then, everything is cut into chunks that can be lazy loaded. But for us, this is too late, because when we talk about micro frontends, we are talking about loading stuff on demand at runtime, stuff we did not even know before, at least not in this very version. That means we want to turn a compile time dependency into a runtime dependency to be more flexible in terms of separate deployments. And so this is not enough. And that's why Webpack introduced this idea of module federation. The idea is to introduce two roles. The first role is the host. In our case, it's the micro frontend shell. The other role is the remote. In our case, it's the micro frontend itself. And everything is now configured. You can say, well, for the shell, I'm mapping this path. MFE1 shell points to another micro frontend over there. That means every time I'm importing something using this URL, I'm loading something from over there, something that's also called MFE1. In this case, MFE1 stands for micro frontend 1. It's quite creative, I know. So just because of looking at this URL mapping, Webpack knows I need to load something from this separately compiled and deployed application. Over there, you can expose files with components, with modules, files with functions. You can expose everything. And now something beautiful happens. I guarantee you, you will love it. Now you can go with a dynamic import using the map names. And this allows us to grab over and to fetch something from over there. And the best of this is that Angular itself does not even recognize that you go with micro frontends. From Angular's perspective, this is just lazy loading, isn't it? That means you can use Angular as is. You can use it without heavyweight complex meta frameworks. If you remember, and this is where the cycle closes, most of the companies I interviewed told me that implementing a meta framework was quite expensive for them, was quite an effort for them. And now I can say, you don't need it. Just go with lazy loading and you are fine. From Angular's perspective, this is lazy loading. From Webpack perspective, this is about micro frontends, because Webpack knows the mapped URL, and so Webpack grabs over there to this micro frontend in order to load it at runtime. Of course, we need some metadata of our micro frontends, and this metadata is compiled by Webpack into a JavaScript file that's called the remote entry point. In production, we are talking about 2 or 3 Ks. In development, it's quite huge. There we are talking about 20 or 30 Ks. In production, it is just a matter of 2 or 3 Ks. This is where the metadata comes from, and this is what needs to be loaded into the shell. because obviously the shell needs to know a bit about the micro front end in order to be capable of talking with it, in order to be capable of loading it on demand. After that, we can really load the micro front end lazily. And one of the best features here is you can share libraries. You can say, well, I'm using Angular, you are using Angular, so why not just load it once and share it? It's a bit like my neighbor I'm sharing the newspaper with. I am reading it in the morning and they are reading it in the afternoon and so on. I'm sharing in this case. And obviously, this leads to more optimized bundle sizes because we just need to load it once. And if you think back to what my customers told me, sharing code is also something that was difficult in the past in the area of micro frontends. It's now as easy as that. It's now as easy as defining those configuration settings. Of course, you can end up with version conflicts when sharing libraries, but to put it in a nutshell, module federation has you covered. It comes with a lot of strategies for dealing with version conflicts. It's about out of scope today. It's a matter of its own, but just remember, there are several strategies for dealing with this. Okay, so now perhaps you are wondering, how can we use this together with Angular? And the answer is, if you want to use it together with Angular, you need a little tiny CLI plugin. A little tiny CLI plugin that is telling Webpack underneath the covers of the CLI to do the module federation game. I've written this plugin for you. You can ng add it to your application. This generates a Webpack config. It's a partial Webpack config, just a matter of 2 screen pages. And this configuration is controlling the behavior of module federation. You need to adjust it a bit, which means you need to fill in placeholders. And then hopefully you can ng serve everything and you should be fine. Then you should be your micro front-end aware architecture. By the way, front-end aware architecture is one word in German. So, you know, we have those big words. Okay, nice. I always say module federation is a bit like the 1980s, you know. You need to experience them in order to know what they are about. And that's why I've prepared a little tiny demonstration for you. Let's have a look to it. So what I have here is a micro frontend. It has those red dashed lines to recognize at first sight, well, this is my micro frontend. And here I have my shell. And you see, both runs on different boards. And no, this is not the prerequisite. Having different boards, having different origins like localhost 3000 and localhost 5000 is not the prerequisite. But I'm doing it here because it proves that both can be deployed separately. And this is what everything is about, deploying it separately into different origins or into different folders of the same origin. And the thing is, when I'm clicking here, then I'm loading my separately compiled and deployed micro frontend into the middle of my shell. How cool is that? So one more time, from Angular's perspective, this is just like lazy loading. If I'm clicking here, you see this micro frontend is loaded, at least just a part of it. It's loaded into the middle of my shell. So it looks like lazy loading, but if you look a bit closer, it is really more than just lazy loading because we did not know this chunk upfront. Here we have localhost 3000, there we have localhost 5000. Also, something that's really impressive is the bundle size here. Look at this. Boy, is this tiny. 1.5K. I have to say I'm running this in production mode. Here I'm really in production mode. That means I have optimized bundles. But yeah, it's really tiny, 1.5Ks. And if you ask me, this really proves that we are sharing Angular, that we are not loading Angular one more time for this very micro frontend. Somehow Module Federation recognizes that we already have Angular in the needed version. Here it's version 12 in place in the middle of our shell, and it's just reused. How pretty is that? Also, I can share data. I can say, hey, I'm Manfred. What I'm doing here is what I'm calling login for honest people. I found out that authentication is pretty simple if every one of us is honest. So let's be honest, this avoids us from implementing difficult authorization schemes. Just kidding. But here I'm saying, hey, I'm Manfred. And when I'm moving over there, one more time, it's a separately compiled and deployed application. This application also knows that I'm Manfred. And this tiny example shows that sharing libraries is not only necessary because of reducing the bundle size, it's also necessary because of the need of sharing data. Of course, don't overdo it. Share as little as possible, because sharing is also coupling your micro frontends together, and coupling is something we really want to avoid when we talk about micro frontends. Okay, let's have a look into the source code of this. Here we see the source code of this. Let me close everything and let's have a look at the folder structure. So what I have here is a mono repo. All my micro frontends are part of this mono repo. And no, this is also not a prerequisite. Both works. You can have one repo with everything. You can have different repos. Both works out there in practice. I've seen both working. Both have different consequences. This is what makes software architecture exciting, dealing with the consequences. But here, for the sake of simplicity, I just go with one repository for the time being. I will change this in the second part of my demonstration. And yeah, here I have my shell, I have my micro frontend, and I have some shared libraries, like my authentication library, that is on the one side sharing code for my honest authentication scheme. And on the other side, it is sharing data, namely the current username. And the best of this is everything in here is traditional Angular code. Nothing special here. It's traditional Angular code. Traditional Angular code with my Module Federation plugin. And this Module Federation plugin gives us a Webpack configuration file. And everything you need to do is adjust this configuration file in order to be capable of loading separately deployed stuff. The most important stuff in here is this part here. You see, it's not much, 2 screen pages, but the most important stuff is in here. This is my Module Federation plugin, which comes with Webpack itself. And here I'm configuring my remote. You see it here. This is about my micro frontend 1. And I'm saying one more time, it's called micro frontend 1. Please emit the metadata into this very file here. Here we have 2 keys, 2 or 3 keys with metadata. It's written into this file. And here I'm saying, hey, my micro frontend is exposing this Angular module under this pretty name. And one more time, this Angular module is really a traditional, simple Angular module, nothing special in here. A simple module with some child routes That means after lazy loading this micro front end, I can directly jump into the child routes. And here I also say, hey, let's share some libraries. I don't want to load Angular core and the rest several times. I want to share it. Here you have a full object which allows you to fine-tune the behavior of module federation in order to tell module federation how to act in the case of a version conflict. There are several strategies you can configure. Yeah, this is everything you need to do. Add the plugin, adjust this configuration file, and suddenly you can load this application into a shell. It's really as simple as that. If we look into the shell, we see the same. Here in the shell, we have a traditional Angular application. And in here, I have the configuration for the shell. What I could do here in the configuration of the shell, I could map above. I could say, well, I have those remotes. There is a remote MFE1, and it points over there to something that's called MFE1. And it has been separately compiled and deployed. Please find the metadata for it here on the remote entry JS. So this could be my micro frontend. That's possible, but here I'm not doing this because what I'm doing here is dynamic module federation. I don't want to know about my micro frontends upfront. That's why I removed this. I just tell Webpack at runtime, well, I know over there is a micro frontend. Now I want to load it. So I'm really going dynamic here. And I think that's the prerequisite in a lot of real world business cases. You start your client, the client is asking the backend, hey backend, which micro frontends do we have today? And the backend is telling it, well, today we have this and that micro frontend in this and that version. And here you find the metadata. So this is done dynamically. But nevertheless, I'm also telling my shell to share some libraries. And now something beautiful happens. My shell has a routing configuration. It really looks at traditional routing configuration. You see it here. Here we have a path. Here we have load children. And normally I could use load children together with a dynamic import, like we are doing every time when going with lazy loading, don't we? But here I'm going one step further. I switched out this dynamic import for this helper function, load remote module. And this allows us to dynamically load our micro frontends. Here we can just assign the key data module federation needs in order to be capable of load it on demand. And this key data comes from a string, which means you can load it from the backend and then use it here. The thing is, you could also use import, but import cannot work with dynamic strings, because even though import looks like a function call, it is not a function call. It is a keyword that is already evaluated at compile time by Webpack. And that's why going with a dynamic string does not work together with import, but this helper function as a drop-in replacement for import has us covered. You see it here, I'm placing the key data like the URL, the name of the micro frontend, the name of the file I've exposed over there. It happens to be an Angular module. And this is what I'm returning here to the router. Yeah, this is everything we need to get started with module federation. How cool is that? So if you ask me, this solves a lot of business needs. And if you allow me to close the cycle one more time, it also tackles the biggest challenges of my customers. Namely, it does not make us to write a meter framework, because Angular does not even recognize that we have micro frontends, and it allows us to share code at runtime. It also allows us to deal with version conflicts. So perhaps you're wondering, what's next for module federation? And yeah, we have several additional features. Because of Angular 12, we can give you some additional features. And the most important feature is, since Angular 12, since last week, Webpack 5 is officially baked into the CLI. Before, the CLI used Webpack 4, and so we needed some dirty tricks to use it together with Webpack 5 and module federation. Tricks like this here. This was an entry we needed in our package JSON, an entry that forced CLI 11 into using Webpack 5, even though it was compiled against Webpack 4. A dirty trick, we don't need it anymore. I'm really happy about this. By the way, this trick only worked with Yarn. Now, as we don't need this trick anymore, you can go with Yarn or with NPM or with some other package manager of your choice. Just make sure that you always use the same package manager in your project, and make sure that also the CLI is using the same package manager. Otherwise, you have a big issue. I had to find it out the hard way in front of a big audience, where nothing worked anymore because the CLI used Yarn while I used NPM in my live coding example. So this is quite nice because of this, it really works straightforward now. Another new feature I can proudly present you is you can now even share libraries of your monorepo. Normally, you can only share NPM packages. You can only make NPM packages to be just loaded once at runtime. But now you can tell Webpack and the plugin, hey, let's act as if this odd library that is just a folder in the monorepo was an NPM package. For this, we need to tweak Webpack a bit. For this, we need to tweak the plugin a bit, but now it works straightforward. And this is also what I did in my case in order to share the username. Now it's just a matter of configuration. Honestly, this was a bit difficult. There was a bug in there, and I'm really happy that I teamed up with Tobias Koppers, which is the inventor of Webpack. He invested about 1 hour to find out the reason of this bug. We have not been sure if the bug was because of the Angular CLI or because of Webpack. We hunted together down this bug, and now we have implemented the solution for this bug as an integrated part of our plugin. So just use the plugin and you are fine. And one more time, thanks to Tobias for this. He's really a great and a very smart guy. I mean, you need to be smart if you implement something like Webpack nowadays. Another new feature, and I really love it, is this command here. When you install the plugin in the newest version, you get this command. You can call run all, and run all is literally running all your applications. I implemented it out of a need because it was somehow annoying to have the need to start all the micro frontends by hand. And so I implemented this script, which is now part of this plugin. Honestly, it is just a matter of, let's say, 100 lines of Node.js code. Perhaps we talk about 150 lines, so it's not a big deal. Most of the time was invested into finding colors I like, finding random colors I like. And yeah, now I'm really happy with the result. By the way, this is also something I'm using here in my example. Meanwhile, during live coding, I did some mistakes. That's why I got some errors here. But you see, in general, I have the output of all my applications here. And I also see which application came up with which output or with which error message. By the way, I've mentioned it before. Here I'm starting everything in production mode. That's why I'm getting this warning, because the Angular CLI is not intended for be used in production, but I'm doing this on purpose to have proper realistic bundle sizes. Okay, so I've talked a lot about monorepos before, but the thing is, Module Federation works perfectly with both, with monorepos and with multiple repos. Both works. Also out in practice, I've seen both working. Both has different consequences, which is always a big discussion in our workshops, because for some reason, there is a lot of emotion in there when it comes to the topic monorepo versus multiple repos. By the way, we decided to synchronize our version with the version of Angular to give you an easier time finding out which version is the right one for your application. We are just synchronizing the major version. The minor could be different. Plus, I want to use this today for an announcement. I want to announce a new member of the Module Federation family. It's called Module Federation Tools. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking source code we need to write several times for our customer projects, and we put it into this tools package. And this shall avoid that you need to write all the boilerplates time and again. Currently, this is quite a young project. It was released yesterday for the first time in a version 0.0.1. The plugin itself is really stable. This is a new project. And the current feature is support for web components, which allows you to share different frameworks. Like you see it here, the shell is using Angular, the Micro-Frontend is using React in this or that version. This allows us to use both together, Module Federation and web components. And so we get the best of both worlds. Because of Module Federation, we can easily share our libraries in cases where we need the same version. If two or several micro-frontends need the same version of Angular, of React, of your design system, they can share it. If they need a different version, they share another version. This is because of the magic of Module Federation. And because we bring web components into the play, we can hide different frameworks underneath the covers. That means this part of the application here does not even recognize that we have another version or even another framework in the other vertical. How cool is that? Yeah, and this is something I want to showcase for you. So perhaps you've already seen it. Here I have a lazy root called React. And this lazy root wants to load a web component that is compiled together with Module Federation. And you know, routing to web components is not that easy. And that's why we get this web component wrapper out of our new library, out of the library, where have I been? Out of the library, Angular Architects module Federation Tools. Yeah, and here this wrapper just gets the key data we need in order to load this web component using module federation. A remote entry point, a remote name, an exposed file that holds some web components, and also the name of my very web component, the element name. Here I'm pointing to something that has really been separately compiled and deployed. I've deployed this to the Azure cloud. I'm using a nice new project. It's called Azure Static Web Apps. It's a perfect fit for single page applications because it's very inexpensive and easy to use. Deploying this under this name in the cloud was a matter of 3 minutes. And I did not even have to leave Studio Code. So it's really straightforward. Something you get when you are using the free tier is you get dynamic names. Somehow they are combining two names like nice grass or gray bond, or I don't know what else. And yeah, this makes it easier to be remembered. Yeah, I'm using this to load an Angular-based web component, a React-based web component, and another Angular-based web component in my very example. And one more time, you only bring web components into the game if you want to mix and match different versions and different frameworks. If you don't need this, please avoid web components because they come with some challenges. There is some overhead and some challenges, but if you need to mix and match everything, this is one way to do it. Well, to showcase this, let me move over to my app component HTML. Let's uncomment this. And now you will see something that's really beautiful. Hey, I'm really loading a React micro-frontend from the Azure cloud into my Angular application. I really like this. And here I'm doing the same with an Angular micro-frontend, an Angular micro-frontend that is using a different version. Here, I'm doing this on purpose. I'm using version 12 RC3. This here is just using version 12. This here too, here I'm using the non-compatible RC3. And here I'm also using RC3 for the micro-frontend B. So perhaps you're wondering what's the cost of this? Well, let's have a look to the network then. If we click here one more time to flights, we see we have really tiny bundle sizes because we can share Angular itself with the shell. Here we are talking about 1K. So let's write it down. Without web components, 1.5K in production. So what's the cost of loading React? Well, obviously, if you now load a React-based micro-frontend, you need to load the React library. And that's why we need to load several bundles here. I think the bundle with 40K contains React itself, and other bundles contain additional source code. So at the end of the day, we are talking about, let's say, 45K. Give or take, without the icon, without the metadata, it's 45K. And please respect that this is a Mickey Mouse web component. If you used bigger parts of React, then this would be even bigger. With web component and React, let's say 50 to 60K. So it's quite a difference. I think this clearly shows why I would rather go without web components if possible. But if you really need to mix and match, if those overhead is not a big deal for you, web components get you covered. So now let's look into Angular. We all know Angular is quite a huge framework. And here you see we need to load Angular core, we need to load Angular common, we need to load a part of our X.js in this very version, everything for version 12 RC3. And so here we end up with about 100K, give or take. And obviously, the more you use from your framework, the bigger the bundles become. And now, and you will love it, let's load the second micro frontend, which is also using version 12 RC3. And now look at this. Now we don't need to load Angular itself one more time. No, because Module Federation is recognizing that we already have version 12 RC3. It came with this micro frontend, and that's why it shared with this micro frontend here. So we only need to load our application bundle. Here it's called Bootstrap, because Bootstrap is the file I'm using to bootstrap my application. And this is really beautiful, isn't it? This is the power of Module Federation. Believe in the power of Module Federation. This is what allows you to share your dependencies. Of course, you get most out of it if you only have one framework and one version, because in this case, you can load highly optimized bundles. So let me redo this. Highly optimized bundles with 1.5K. Awesome, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, you are the first audience I'm showing this to. You have a lot of possibilities. Well, perhaps you are wondering what are future features where we have something in the pipeline. First of all, it shall be an evolution and not a revolution. So just expect tiny add-ons that make your life easier. Of course, we want to keep track with upcoming Angular CLI versions. This is the most important goal. We want to add more web component support for the case you need it. We want to add server-side rendering support because one of my customers needs it. And we want to add further tooling for reducing boilerplate. So when we find out that we need to implement some functionality for a lot of customers, we try to bake it into this library here. So the future is bright. Let me come to a conclusion. What did we see today? Well, we saw that micro frontends are not a free lunch. As every time we need to do decisions, as every time we need to do software architecture, we need to concentrate on the consequences. We need to evaluate, we need to find out, for instance, if micro frontends are an issue solver or a source of pain. And if it is the one or the other, only depends on your current situation. It's about scaling your teams and implementing domains in isolation. That means very likely if you have several teams, micro frontends are a good fit for you. If you only have one team, then perhaps you go with domain slicing. But in this case, you implement your domains in another way. And yeah, Module Federation is really a game changer, because it allows us to do all of this in a quite straightforward manner. And there is a last thing I really want you to remember. If you forget everything, please always remember this one aspect, namely remember the story with the motorcycle and the scooter. Because on the one side, it's a funny story, and on the other side, it reminds us that there is not the perfect solution in general. There is not the perfect architecture in general. There are also architecture candidates that fit more or less to what we want to achieve, to our current architectural goals. If you keep this in mind, life will be a lot easier for you. Life will be easier for you in general. Okay, so thanks for having me. Here you have my contact data. Feel free to reach out to me via Twitter, for instance, or feel free to ask your questions. Of course not. Yeah, that's it. Darek, are you still here?
Yeah, Manfred. So let's talk about the course now.
Correct.
And after that, we do the Q&A session. Mm-hmm. Can you show us this website?
Yeah. So it's a beautiful new website. Darek did a good job this week. Darek invested a lot of time into a relaunch and redesign, and I kind of like it.
Yeah, just go to webinar angularmaster.dev.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So even though this picture looks like something that is about heavyweight architectures, we are also talking about lightweight architectures. And yeah, below here we have the agenda. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Let's discuss the agenda in details.
Yeah. Shall I tell a bit about the agenda points here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm doing here in this course, I'm calling it the Hitchcock principle. The course is about like a Hitchcock movie. We start very easy and then it is getting tougher and tougher. But we start with something I'm calling strategic design. Not only me is calling it, also the community is calling it. Strategic design comes out of domain-driven design, and it allows you to architect an application where the business domains are more or less separated, where you have business domains that don't need to know much about each other. For this, there are several tricks in strategic design we can apply when planning our micro-frontend. And then the next step is to implement this strategic design. And for this, we are using several techniques. We start with a lightweight solution. We go with an NX monorepo. That means we find a way to implement our business domains and isolate them to make sure that one business domain is not allowed to access another one. This can really easily be implemented with NX. We see how to visualize our architecture with NX. We see how to categorize our libraries. If you split everything into verticals, into domains, and into libraries that are part of those domains, categorizing them really makes thinking about this architecture and talking about this architecture easier. And so we will talk about several different categories that make our life easier. We also talk about enforcing our architecture that makes sure that one part is not coupled to another part. We don't want to have coupling by incidence. We also look into incremental tests and builds in order to speed up everything, because we don't want to recompile all the parts of our big software system. CI times, build times, times invested for testing is a huge issue in the world of Angular. And here we got you covered. Here we present you some strategies to do it incrementally, to retest and rebuild only everything that has been changed. And for this, the local and distributed build cache plays a big role. Then we are saying, well, what would be if our business domains would be different applications. And this is where we are entering the world of micro-frontends. We are looking into module federation quite closely to find out how to leverage module federation to make this work. We also discuss alternatives to module federation. We see how to integrate everything, how to load everything dynamically, how to share dependencies, how to deal with version conflicts. There are several ways of dealing with version conflicts, how to establish communication, how to share widgets. And also we are doing some bonuses because now we have this big architecture and some people are wondering, how does state management and NGRX fit into this architecture? How does this fit to micro-frontends? How does this fit to monorepos? And that's why we talk about NGRX a bit. This is not a fully blown NGRX introduction, but you will get a quick overview of NGRX and you get questions answered, namely, how does this fit together, which is one of the biggest questions when it comes to software architecture. How does this fit together? We also talk about NGRX best practices like dealing with view models and normalization. We also talk a lot about authentication and security, which is always a big topic because somehow we need to integrate existing identity providers like your Active Directory, and then you want to have single sign-on even though you have different micro-frontends. We even talk about current best practices that come with modern authentication standards like OAuth 2.1. OAuth 2.1 is heavily used nowadays to couple yourself loosely to something like an Active Directory. A new version will show up and this new version will change a lot of things according to current best practices. We also talk about Ivy. Ivy, the new Angular compiler, and this will be the final outlook, gives us new possibilities that will influence our architecture in the midterm. And so I think this is quite a nice chapter to finish with because it gives us an outlook. It shows us how our architecture might be influenced by Ivy and by its potential in the next months and years. Which is important because if we talk about enterprise software, we always have a planning horizon for several years, even for several decades, for instance. Yeah, that's it pretty much.
Yeah, that's perfect. Who is it for, Manfred?
Sorry?
Who is it for?
Good question. So I'm always saying this course is for everyone who knows Angular and now wants to build huge sustainable applications. I'm always saying our course is starting where a traditional introduction into Angular stops. Normally, a traditional introduction into Angular involves structuring an application with ng modules and folders, and then it stops. And this is where we start, because we start at the point where we say just having folders and ng modules is not enough. We need a bit more. We need business domains, we need libraries, we need access restrictions, we need micro-frontends. This is where we start, and that's why we are going through all those topics.
Okay. Some people asking what is different between this online course and some online training like you do regularly?
Yeah, good question. So this course here is a video course. I'm also doing live remote courses, but this one here is a video course. And this has several advantages. One advantage is you are more flexible in terms of your learning time. You can look the recordings when you have time, for instance, at the evening, or if you have some slack at your company. Another advantage is you can concentrate on topics you need to know. You can just leave out topics you already know. This is always a big issue with live workshops, because at the end of the day, we are talking about adult education. We are all adults. And compared to child education, when it comes to adult education, everyone has some existing knowledge. And it's always boring to listen at the instructor telling you something you already know. And so you can just skip what you already know and focus on stuff you want to know. Also, as this is a video course, it's more inexpensive. That's also an advantage. There is also a disadvantage, namely we cannot discuss because it's a recorded video, but we had a clever idea, especially Darek come up with this idea and we really like it. We are doing office hours. That means we are meeting 4 times at the evenings, and at these 4 times we are doing live discussions. That means we can use these office hours, these synchronous parts, in the best possible way to discuss, to answer your questions. Perhaps you have an issue with a lab. Perhaps you also have questions how to bring everything we learned into the context of your application. And for this, we have the business hours. That means at the end of the day, we get the best of both worlds, the best of synchronous workshops and the best of video courses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's perfect explanation. Okay, so I think it's a perfect time for Q&A session. What do you think?
Great. Let's do a Q&A.
Okay. I will copy and paste the question from YouTube to Zoom. You can start with these Zoom questions. Okay.
Hi, Manfred. You mentioned that there are a few strategies for version dependency conflicts between projects. I know you said that's for another webinar, but could you kind of brush over like those techniques?
Yeah, with pleasure. So one thing Module Federation can do is it can find out what is the highest compatible version, which is quite a fancy term, the highest compatible version. Let's say you have version 10 on the one side and 10.1 on the other side. In this case, 10.1 is the highest compatible version. And what Module Federation can do is it can look at the metadata at startup. It can do something I'm calling version negotiation. And so it finds out that we need to take the highest compatible version from this micro-frontend and not from that micro-frontend, and everyone is happy. Another strategy would be to load an own version for all the different micro-frontends. I could say, well, the 2 of you need Angular 10, you can share Angular 10. Those 2 of you need Angular 12, so you get 1 instance of Angular 12 to be shared. That's another strategy. And you can even tell Module Federation that it is only allowed to load 1 version of Angular. You can define a singleton. But in this case, you might have an issue if some parts have been compiled against Angular 10 and other parts have been compiled against Angular 12, because, you know, a major version is not backwards compatible. In this case, you can make Module Federation to emit a warning or even to emit a runtime error so that you find out very soon about this conflict. It's really a matter of configuration. There are a lot of options here. Also combining it with web components. What we did today is one option to hide your concrete framework and framework version.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Manfred, one question. I've been following your plugin, and you could always do your library sharing in a monorepo previously as well. You mentioned this is something new or something changed. So I fail to understand what has been improved, or is this something changed in that sense?
Well, if you always used module federation, then you are covered. However, some years ago, as module federation was not a topic, I used another trick. I used Webpack externals plus UMD bundles. I just loaded UMD bundles into the browser, into the global namespace. I think we all know what I mean when I'm referring to the global namespace. And this allowed me to share these UMD bundles with Angular Core and Angular Common across several separately compiled micro-frontends. And the thing is, about, let's say, 3 to 1 years ago, this was the best option we had. Before we had module federation, this was the best option. Nowadays, module federation is more straightforward because it is sharing stuff for you automatically. You don't have to deal with UMD bundles. You know, UMD bundles is about ECMAScript 5. It's about this world where we did not have a module system in ECMAScript. So it's pre-2015. 1015, this is, you know, the emperor of the empire. No, it's about 2015. And it's also about not being tree shakeable, because tree shakeability was not a big concern back then. So given all of that, nowadays you would be better off with module federation. Back then, using UMD bundles, using the global namespace was the best option you had.
Sorry, I completely couldn't explain it correctly. What I meant is when you showed an example to share an NX library, you know, a local library not published to NPM, is there something changed in relation to Webpack to Angular 12 and your updates, or has it, because you were able to do it in Angular 11 as well, right? Like with obviously the experimental support, but your plugin was supporting that already, correct?
Yeah.
You could, so that is.
So sorry for giving a big wrong answer or the right answer to the wrong question. So if you already used version 11 of this plugin, then you don't need to do much. In order to make this sharing stuff work seamlessly, we need to generate the Webpack config in a slightly different way. So everything you need to do is look up how we generate the Webpack config now and adjust your Webpack config. It's not a big deal. You just need to adjust it slightly.
And that's because some bugs are fixed that has changed how we share the library and makes it easier to share the code.
Yeah. There have been some issues on the connection point between Webpack and the Angular CLI. And thanks to the inventor of the Webpack package, we hunted this bug down, and the solution is to just use a slightly different Webpack configuration.
Perfect, thank you.
Very welcome.
Hi, Manfred. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah, I would like to make you a question about the dynamic module federation, because if I'm not wrong or I haven't understood it properly, for example, in our company, when we make the bundles, we name the file with a hash to prevent cache issues. So if we move to micro-frontends and we make a dynamic import of those files, we can retrieve it from with a backend call and put it in the routing file.
It's possible, or echo. Can you try to get rid of the echo? It's a bit difficult.
Sorry, can you hear me better now?
Now it's far better. Thank you.
Okay. What I try to say, sorry, is that, for example, in our company, when we make the bundles of the application, we name the files with a hash to prevent cache issues.
Yeah, yeah.
So with dynamic import, could we make a call to the backend to insert that new version of the name in the Angular routine, or?
Yeah, totally, totally. So the thing is, if you deploy a new version, you don't even need to know about the hash values in the file names. Everything you need to know is where the metadata of this current version can be found. And most of my companies or most of my customers are just calling a backend service that tells the client, well, client, the version you should use now has a metadata file, and please find the metadata file here. For instance, you could also have the version as part of the URL or something like this. So this you will get from your lookup service. And then everything you need to do is to feed this load children helper function with this URL. And yeah, then you are covered. The metadata tells Webpack underneath the covers what else to load. And this also includes hash values if there are any.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome. Cool. So let me look up the chat. Tarek was that nice to repeat the questions here in the chat.
Yeah, I have a question as well. So in a normal Angular applications, we have these app initializers like a preload service. We generally use it for loading internationalizations and all that sometimes. So when we have this module federation, is there a way to have some an initialization which happens before we load that module? Because if I don't know at runtime how many modules are loading, they might have their own stuff or binding and files and all those, which I want to load only when I load the module.
Yeah, totally. I love this question. I really should include this into my examples. The cool answer is everything that works with lazy loading also works with module federation, because Angular does not know that we have micro-frontends. That means you can just use everything you've seen together today. For instance, my lazy routes pointing to micro-frontends together with a preloading strategy, and you are fine.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome. Yeah, this is one of the cool stuff of Webpack module federation. At the end of the day, it's just lazy loading.
All right.
I have a question as well. Thanks for the presentation and the awesome NPM models to start with. And the question is, I'm joining the team now who wants to turn, they have like several, well, 3 different Angular applications responsible for different logic. At the moment, they want to turn this into a shell that loads micro-frontends. But we also want to be able to have separate teams that work with React, for example, in future. So my current vision is it would be nice to use just pure Angular without any web component wrappers, because using the same version is not an issue, at least at this stage. So just using normal lazy loading would be a really simple solution without any overhead, and it just for the shell it's just like loading simple lazy models, right? But my concern is about the React part. If we don't wrap anything in web components, then it's just and use an Angular shell at the root at the shell level, just to use an Angular parent application, then it's all Angular router context. But what if I want a React micro frontend to have its own nested routing?
Oh yeah.
Any suggestions or links would help a lot if one of your customers or you yourself face this issue and how to solve it.
Yeah, indeed, we have this situation with several customers, and there are two solutions, namely a beautiful solution and a powerful solution. Let's get started with the beautiful solution. The beautiful solution, because it is straightforward, is to just go with one router, for instance, with the Angular router. And this one router could create dynamic routes using metadata from the micro-frontends. And it does not be necessary that those micro-frontends are Angular-based. Perhaps they are using some other framework. They just emit some metadata via a REST service, and this metadata is created to dynamically create routes. And those routes, in turn, load our web components from over there. So here we are also talking about web components. This is the beautiful solution because it is straightforward. We don't need to squeeze our frameworks in a direction they are not intended for. Another solution, this is the powerful solution, and you can imagine it's not that beautiful, is to go with several routers. You would have your shell with an ng router, and the ng router could load a component, a wrapper component with a web component, and this web component could have a router of its own, namely the React router. So this now is a bit like subrouting, child routes, hierarchical routes in Angular, but with the big difference that this router is not really aware of that router and vice versa. So they will compete a bit over the URL. And now you need to tweak those routers a bit so that they know when they should look at the URL and when they should just ignore it. There are several tricks like going with URL matches. Instead of using a hard-coded path, go with a URL matcher that tells the router when it should react upon this very URL and when it should just ignore the URL because it's intended for the inner router. It's doable, but it's not that easy. You need to invest a bit hard blood and time and passion. But if you really, really want to accomplish that, you can make it to be accomplished. I've written a blog article about this. I'm calling it Micro-Frontends with multiple frameworks and versions, the good, the bad, the ugly. And the name is for a reason, because you need some workaround, especially if it comes to the router. Let me copy this into the chat. Here you have the write-up of this. Of course, just going with one router, which is respecting dynamic routes and metadata of the React application, is easier.
Okay, just one clarification, just to ensure I got the beautiful one right. So if I understood you correctly, it's the first one implies we do not use a router in the React application at all, but we fake the router with Angular from above. We pass some context to the React application that tells what to load depending on conditions, right? Is that?
Yeah, totally. And perhaps you have even two versions of your React application. One version can use the router. The other version is just emitting metadata so that the Angular router knows which routes we need for the React web components.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Could be a matter of compilation. Once you compile this, once you compile out that version. Cool, great.
Manfred, is it important to use web component to share multiple Angular frameworks or multiple frameworks?
It's not really necessary. you can also load 2 different Angular versions without web components. But the good thing is a web component is hiding the details of your framework. Plus, you can always use other web components because web components are rendered by the browser at first. So if it is about mixing and matching components from different frameworks and different versions, web components really have a big advantage because you can always call another web component. But just for technical reasons, you could also live without web components. I would go with web components here because it makes mixing and matching your components easier. Okay, let me look up the chat. We had some questions here. Sebastian Gauss is asking, will be recorded, available? Yeah, I think so, that Tarek will record this and put it somewhere on the web. Christian, hi Christian, by the way, it's good to see you here. I know Christian for several years. We are brothers in, not in arms, but brothers in NX. Hau rein, yeah. Cool. So he just told me, make a good presentation. Thank you for this. Is the DDD repo still maintained? I saw a lot of issues there. Yeah, so the DDD repo is still maintained and a lot of my customers are using it. In the last weeks, the focus was on module federation, but as DDD is still a part of my story, yeah, please expect some new versions quite soon. Have you tried use Micro-Frontends as part of mobile apps? Would you recommend any tools and frameworks for this? Well, the thing is, when we talk about mobile apps, always bundle sizes are a big issue. And that's why, in my case here, module federation without web components would be a good fit. Module federation, where you just agree on one Angular major version. Because in this case, you have these optimizations we've seen before. That means restrict yourself to one major version, go with module federation, and you should be fine in terms of bundle sizes, which is important for mobile apps. Yeah, it works with an X and without an X. Everything we've seen today can also be used together with an X. How to handle routing between multiple frameworks or framework versions? Lars asked, by the way, hi Lars, always good to see you. Yeah, so if we just go with one Angular major version, then we can use traditional routing and child routes. If we go with different frameworks like Angular and React, then we have to go with one of the tricks we've discussed before. How can we prevent loading federated module by entities that should not be allowed to load it? Oh yeah, so the good question is, like with lazy loading, just use the router, use guards, and you can prevent it. The thing is, I'm always saying when we talk about mechanisms in the front end, those mechanisms are not primarily about security, they are more about usability. We want to prevent the user from loading something he or she is not allowed to use, because it's a bit depressing if they filled out a huge form just to get the information, hey, you are not allowed to fill out this form. It was for nothing. So we want to avoid this for the reason of usability. But the real security is always in the backend. So make sure your backend service is not respecting or allowing you to send data over if you don't have the necessary access rights. everything in the front end like a guard is more for usability reasons. Why no testing in the agenda of the course? Something about integration testing. Yeah, you are right. So at the end of the day, when we are go with module federation or with micro frontends in general, you need to have a sound set of integration tests. We are not focusing on this in our course because the course is more about the architecture, and we feel that the testing story should be a story of its own. You can easily do, and by the way, we also have a 3 days testing workshop, which just deals with those topics. That's why we don't do it here, because yeah, it is a huge topic and it would not fit into this course here. But yeah, nevertheless, it's an important topic, and you should look into integration testing. Look into something like Cypress, for instance, when you go with micro frontends, because with micro frontends you are turning compile time dependencies into runtime dependencies. What about changing MFE URLs on different environments? How to share browser storage between micro frontends during development? Well, I guess those are 2 questions. If you just want to change the URL, then I would recommend to go with dynamic federation, which means you need to look up the URL you are supposed to use now, and then to use this URL together with something like load children. That's the first answer. And the second answer is how to share browser storage between micro frontend during development. Well, I'm not sure if I really understood the question, but the thing is, normally your browser storage runs in the origin of your shell. That means you can easily share your shared storage, your local storage across your micro frontends. Yeah, they can come from different origins, but they are loaded with a script tag. And if you load something with a script tag, it runs in the origin of your shell. So sharing data is possible here. Is it possible to send parameters between the host and the remote? Yeah, it's totally possible. Just go with a shared library like I did. In my example, I shared the username. Where is it? Localhost 5000. I shared the username Manfred. Via a shared library. The good thing is the shared library is only loaded once, and so we only have the data structures within it once, and those data structures are written here and read there. So this is the key, but please don't overdo it, because sharing too much data is coupling everything together, and coupling is something we want to prevent. Is there a link for the code? Yeah, you've already discovered the link, and I guess Darek will also send out the link. Thanks for this. We saw remote components used only in different routes, but can we use them inside of a template? Yeah. So meanwhile, thanks to Ivy, we can also lazy load components. So if you look up how to lazy load components with Ivy, you also know how to lazy load those components from different micro frontends, because from Angular perspective, it's the same. That is something that works. And it would be important for a dashboard, I guess, where you have a lot of tiles coming from different domains. Thank you very much. Yeah, you are welcome. Julian, when you are talking about NX, every team can each other project? Can we prevent teams to edit each other projects? Yeah. So the thing is, you don't need to go with an X. You can go with different repositories. In this case, you can prevent that one team is dealing around with the source code of other teams. If everything is in a big monorepo, then everyone can see all the source code and everyone can modify the source code. And this is where your CI process comes in, or in general, your development process, because to avoid that everyone messes with your code, you can define code owners. A code owner is a person or a group of people that needs to do the pull requests or need to do the review of pull requests if the pull requests is touching something in their code base, in their folders. And yeah, in this case, you just deal with this on an organizational level. Everything can send you pull requests for everything, but you as a code owner has to say, yeah, I'm merging this pull request, or no, I'm not merging it because I don't know, it's ugly, or I don't like you. You have not been nice to me recently, so I don't merge your stuff. Yeah, this article, as Davar said, is sharing the powerful and not that beautiful approach of combining several routers. Can you give a quick example of module federation library sharing in a situation with a monorepo? Yeah, of course. As a matter of fact, I already did it. Namely, this authentication library is a monorepo based library. If you look into my monorepo, it's just a part in here. And in order to share it across our micro-frontends with my plugin, everything you need to do is to mention the path mapping of this library here in this data structure. The rest is done by the magic underneath the covers in a way that works straightforward. So just put it here and you should be fine. So what else do we have? Without the monorepo, yeah. So if we did it without the monorepo, then it would be the same. But in this case, you either, go away. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
You either mention the package here you want to share. In this case, it's a NPM package you want to share. You only want to load once at runtime. Or if it is not a shared library, but a different micro-frontend, you can just point to its URL using this. In this case, it's not a matter for you if this comes from the same or from a different monorepo. Does this answer your question? I take this for a yes. Okay, what else have we got? Thank you. Yeah, I thank you for coming. Yeah, so with version 12, Daval is right. You don't need this trick anymore with yarn and the resolutions in the package JSON. And if you are using monorepos, you should look into how we are now generating the Webpack config. There are some tiny but important changes in order to make using a monorepo more straightforward.
Awesome, awesome. Manfred, the last question I asked previously, does it show beautiful or powerful approach? What did you say? Was it the beautiful one or the powerful one?
This was the powerful one. The beautiful one is what I showcased today. Here I just have one router and I'm just routing to ordinary micro-frontends without having additional routers.
Thank you.
And the powerful is the case where those micro-frontends have a router of their own.
Okay.
What is required, very welcome, what is required to marry Edge Dynamic Module Federation and Angular BWA? Let me think this through. So in my opinion, if you want to combine BWA with service worker caching and dynamic module federation, you needed to go, I did not try it out, but I think you needed to go with your own service worker. Your own service worker, you load into your shell on demand, and you can register it for this or for that directory. I think loading the service worker separately should do the job here. But as mentioned, I did not try this constellation out. So if you try it out, please let me know your findings. But I think loading them separately should do the job, loading them and registering them for different URLs, which is something the API of Service Worker allows you to do. Okay, cool. That's for the questions in the chat. Are there any additional questions so far?
Okay, so Manfred, thank you so much for this great session. A lot of great information. So as always, what can I say? So thank you everybody for today's great meeting. And yeah, hope to see you soon. I will send you all information tomorrow about the links to this webinar and information also about the course. So thank you so much one more time.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.